Europe was built on a promise: never again. Never again war, never again division, never again collapse. After 2 world wars that burned the continent to the ground, Europe chose cooperation over conflict, treaties over trenches, and shared prosperity over endless revenge. Borders softened, currencies merged, and generations grew up believing that peace was permanent. But history has never respected good intentions. So what if that promise failed? What if the European Union collapsed? Today on Wikivedia Plus, we will explore what would really happen if the European Union collapsed. Let's dive in. The collapse of the European Union would not begin with tanks rolling through capitals or bombs falling from the sky. It would begin quietly: a referendum here, a veto there, a government refusing to follow a court ruling, a nationalist party winning an election, a treaty ignored. At first, it would look technical, manageable, even boring. But beneath the surface, the foundations of Europe would already be cracking. Trust between states would erode, coordination would stall, and solidarity would turn into suspicion. The first real shock would hit the economy. The European Union is not just a political idea. It is the largest single market on Earth. Goods, services, capital, and people move freely across 27 countries. The moment that system fractures, borders return, customs checks slow trade. Supply chains that took decades to optimize collapse in days. A factory in Germany waits for parts stuck at a border in Poland. A supermarket in Italy faces shortages, prices rise, inflation accelerates. Panic spreads faster than governments can react. Then comes the euro. A shared currency cannot survive political chaos for long. Investors would immediately flee weaker economies. Southern Europe would experience massive capital flight, banks would face runs. Governments would impose emergency controls to stop people from withdrawing their savings. The euro could split into national currencies or collapse entirely, triggering a financial crisis larger than 2008. Overnight, millions would see their savings lose value, while debt would explode. Unemployment would surge. Millions of Europeans who relied on free movement for work would suddenly become foreigners. Nurses, construction workers, truck drivers, engineers trapped between borders that no longer recognized their rights. Protests would erupt in major cities. Governments would scramble for solutions they no longer have the tools to implement. Faith in institutions would evaporate. But the most dangerous consequences would not be economic. They would be political. The European Union acts as a stabilizer between nations with centuries of unresolved rivalries. Without Brussels, old tensions would resurface. Border disputes, minority issues, migration routes, and resource conflicts would no longer be managed collectively, but nationally. Hungary versus its neighbors. Greece versus Turkey, Spain, and Catalonia. Even Belgium itself might not survive intact. Eastern Europe would face a particularly dark reality. For countries like Poland, the Baltic states, and Romania, the European Union is not just about money or regulations. It is a shield. Its collapse would leave them exposed. Russia would not need tanks to expand its influence. Energy dependence, cyber pressure, disinformation, and political financing would quietly reshape governments. One by one, states could drift into Moscow's orbit without a single shot being fired. Germany and France would face a historic dilemma. Either attempt to rebuild a smaller, tighter union or retreat inward. Germany, deeply dependent on exports, would suffer enormously from fragmented markets. France might attempt leadership, but without legitimacy and unity, it would fail. Europe would fragment into competing blocs: Northern, Southern, and Eastern Europe, each pulling in a different strategic direction. NATO would weaken as well. The European Union and NATO are deeply interconnected. A divided Europe would mean a divided defense strategy. The United States would lose its most reliable partner. Collective security would become conditional and fragile. Smaller states would feel abandoned. Quietly, arms races would begin. Military spending would rise, not for cooperation, but out of fear. Migration would become explosive. Without EU-wide agreements, frontline states would be left alone. Borders would harden. Refugees would be pushed back violently. Humanitarian norms would collapse alongside political ones. Europe's image as a moral and diplomatic power would shatter. Globally, the consequences would be seismic. China would see opportunity, replacing EU-wide regulations with bilateral deals that favor Beijing. The Belt and Road Initiative would expand deep into Europe. Africa would lose its largest unified trading partner, increasing instability. The Middle East would face a weaker Europe, less capable of diplomacy, mediation, and reconstruction. And then there is democracy. For all its flaws, the European Union restrains authoritarian impulses. Courts, laws, and shared standards limit how far governments can go. Without those constraints, illiberal regimes would rise faster. Media freedom would shrink. Minority rights would erode. Surveillance would expand. The continent that helped invent modern democracy could slowly abandon it. But perhaps the most devastating loss would be psychological. Europeans would lose the belief that cooperation works. That peace is built, not inherited, that history can be escaped. A generation raised without borders would suddenly inherit them again. Passports would matter. Identities would harden. Fear would replace trust. And here's the part nobody talks about. The collapse of the European Union would not stay in Europe. It would rewrite the global balance of power. A fragmented Europe would no longer be a pole of stability, but a vacuum others rush to fill. Could Europe survive without the European Union? Yes. Would it thrive? Unlikely. Would the world be safer? Almost certainly not. Because the European Union is not just an institution. It is a warning from history and a fragile promise to the future. The European Union was never perfect. But perfection was never the point. It was an experiment in survival. And if it fails, the lesson will be brutal. History does not forgive those who forget it. If the European Union collapsed tomorrow, would your country be safer or more alone? Tell us what you think in the comments. This is the end of today's story. If you enjoyed this deep dive, subscribe to Wikivedia Plus and suggest the next topic you want us to uncover. Until the next documentary, stay curious.